The boy who went to court alone to clear his father's name, his words shocked the entire trial. The court was packed that day. Everyone was curious about the case of Mr. Jackson, a poor working man accused of theft. If convicted, he would have to spend many years in prison. But what surprised everyone the most was the appearance of a skinny boy, wearing old clothes, with teary eyes but full of determination. That afternoon, after a heavy rain shower, the dirt road leading to the small neighborhood became slippery and muddy. Mr. Jackson and Thomas, father and son, walked silently on the familiar road after a tiring day of work at the woodworking factory. The two did not say much, only the sound of their footsteps on the wet ground. "Are you tired today?" Mr. Jackson asked, his voice warm. Thomas shook his head, smiling. "No, I'm just helping Dad after school. I'm not tired. Tomorrow we have money. I want to buy a birthday cake, but I only need a small one." Mr. Jackson looked at his son, his eyes gentle but full of pity. That man worked hard all his life, every callus on his hands, every drop of sweat poured down just to hope his son would have a better life. He chuckled, patting Thomas's head. "Okay, tomorrow I'll try to earn more. My Thomas is a good boy." Suddenly from afar, a loud scream rang out. "Robbery! Robbery! Can anyone help?" Mr. Jackson and Thomas turned around in surprise. At the end of the street, an elderly woman fell flat on her face in a puddle, her bag flying far away. A dark shadow flashed by, blended into a small alley, and disappeared. Without time to think, Mr. Jackson quickly ran to help the old woman up. "Are you okay?" But at that moment, the people around turned suspicious eyes towards him, a tall man. "It's him. I saw him standing closest to her. That's right, looking at his shabby appearance, he must have robbed to get money to spend." Thomas panicked and pulled his father's sleeve. "Dad? What are they saying? You didn't do anything!" Mr. Jackson froze. The accusations from the people around him were like thousands of knives stabbing into his heart. He opened his mouth to explain, but his voice choked. I didn't. I just helped her." But no one listened. The whispers grew louder. Some even started taking out their phones to record. "Never mind. Just hand him over to the police and we'll figure it out. A poor person like him doesn't have money to live. If he doesn't rob, how can he feed his children?" The police arrived. Mr. Jackson was taken away in shock and pain. Thomas ran after him, tears streaming down his face. "Dad! You didn't do anything wrong. Don't arrest my dad. Please believe my dad." But no one listened to the boy. They saw only a poor man, without power, without an alibi. A man who could easily be a criminal in their eyes. Thomas ran after the car carrying his father, his small legs trying their best but unable to catch up. Rain began to fall lightly, mixing with his tears. He turned to look at the crowd, who had just been chatting away. In Thomas's eyes, they suddenly became frighteningly unfamiliar. He fell to his knees, his two hands clutching the hem of a man standing nearby, his voice shaking with panic. "Uncle, I beg you, please tell the police that my father is innocent. He just wanted to help the old lady. I beg you." The man looked down at the boy awkwardly, but after a second he shook his head, taking a few steps back as if touching Thomas would get him into trouble. "Kid, who knows who is a good person and can be so unlucky? If your father is innocent, then let the police investigate." Thomas turned to an old woman, his eyes filled with hope. "Grandma, I know you're the one who lost the things. Tell me, my father is not a thief." "I beg you." The old woman squinted, looking confused, but then just sighed. "I'm not sure either. I only know that after falling, I opened my eyes and saw your father standing right there. It might not be him, but maybe it's because your father is too poor." Those words were like a knife to Thomas's heart. He knelt on the ground, his hands clenched, his lips trembling. "No, it can't be. Your father didn't do that. He's not a bad person." Around, whispers rang out again. "Poor child. But what can you do? Life is like that. Not everyone is lucky. It's not certain that it's an injustice. Just let the police handle it. This child shouldn't cry anymore." "Never mind. This matter has nothing to do with you. Why worry about it?" Thomas looked at each person, his eyes filled with pain. No one would believe his father. No one would come forward to help. In that moment, he felt like the whole world had turned its back on them. Thomas's small hands clenched into fists. He knew he could no longer rely on anyone. If no one would help, he would save his father with his own strength. He stood up, his eyes shining with determination. If the world didn't believe in his father, he would make them believe. The next morning, Thomas woke up early. He hadn't slept last night, just sitting there hugging his father's old shirt. His tears had dried up. Today, he had to find a way to save his father. On the road leading to the police station, the little boy was in the middle of the bustling crowd. No one cared about him. No one knew that in his heart he was carrying both pain and fear. Entering the police station, Thomas went straight to the reception desk, his hands clutching the hem of his shirt, his voice trembling but determined. "Uncle, I want to see my father. My father is not a thief." The young policeman looked up at the skinny boy in front of him, sighing. "You are Mr. Jackson's son, right? Your father is currently being detained for investigation. You should go home. Wait until the trial date and the court will decide." "But uncle, I know my father didn't do it. I was standing there, I saw my father just wanted to help the old lady." Thomas sobbed, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. The policeman shook his head, his voice gentle but firm. "I understand how you feel, but this can't be solved with words. To prove your father's innocence, we need evidence. If we don't have it, we have to wait for the trial." That sentence seemed to sink Thomas into the abyss. The boy bit his lip, his eyes red. "So, can I see my father for a moment? I want to talk to him." The policeman was silent for a moment and then nodded slightly. The door to the temporary room opened. The space was cold. The pale yellow light fell down, creating long shadows on the ground. Thomas rushed in, saw his father leaning against the wall, his face more haggard than yesterday. "Dad?" Mr. Jackson looked up, saw his son. He quickly walked over, but his hands were still cuffed. He smiled lightly, but his eyes were full of pain. "Thomas, why did you come here? Aren't you scared?" Thomas shook his head, tears welling up. "I'm not scared. I just want to tell you. I believe you. I know you did nothing wrong." Hearing his son speak, Mr. Jackson gently closed his eyes, a drop of water silently falling. He had never cried in his life, but at this moment his heart felt like it was breaking. "I'm fine. I'm just worried about you. Remember to eat well when you're home alone. Don't worry too much about me. Everything will be fine." But what if no one believes me? What if they don't release Dad?" Thomas choked. Mr. Jackson looked at his son for a long time, then said softly, "Thomas, in this world, the truth is not always easy to accept. But as long as you believe in me, I'm satisfied." Thomas clenched his fists, looking at his father with a determined gaze. "No, not only do I believe, I will make everyone believe too. I will find a way to save Dad." Those words were small but carried extraordinary power. Mr. Jackson looked at his son in amazement, and the policeman standing next to him also sighed softly. A boy who was only 10 years old, but already had such a great responsibility on his shoulders. Thomas turned and walked out of the detention room. At this moment, there was only one thought in his mind: to find the truth, to save his father at all costs. On the day of the trial, it didn't rain today, but the atmosphere was heavy as if a dark cloud had covered the whole city. In front of the courthouse gate, groups of people gathered, gossiping about adultery. "I heard it's hard to get an acquittal in this case." "That's right. A poor person who works hard. Where does he get money? If not stealing, then what? Poor son, the day before saw him running around asking for help. Everyone shook their heads. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even more tense. The ceiling lights were bright. The cold wooden chairs were lined up. The audience sat tightly on both sides. Everyone was waiting for the development of the trial. In the front row, Thomas sat motionless, his two small hands clasped together. His eyes were fixed on the door where his father was about to step out. The door at the back of the courtroom opened. Two policemen escorted Mr. Jackson in. The sound of chains clanging echoed in the suffocating silence. Mr. Jackson was wearing a loose prison uniform. His worn-out plastic slippers made dry sounds on the tiled floor. His face was much more haggard than before. His eyes were sunken from sleepless days in the detention room. All eyes were on him. Some people pitied him. Some were skeptical. There were also those who were just curious to see a case that had nothing to do with them. Thomas bit his lip, tears welling up in his eyes, but he tried to hold them back. He couldn't cry now. He had to be strong. So this day had come. Mr. Jackson walked slowly. Each step felt like 1,000 pounds more. He wasn't afraid of prison. He wasn't afraid of being convicted. What he feared most was his son's eyes. When he saw Thomas sitting there, his eyes red but still shining with strong faith, his heart felt like it was being squeezed. "My son, do you still believe in me?" Since the day he was arrested, he had prepared for the worst. He thought Thomas would be desperate, would cry until he had no more tears, maybe even hate him for pushing their lives into tragedy. But no, his son was still there, fighting for him, believing in him. He couldn't give up. No, he couldn't fall. No matter what, he still had to keep his faith in his son. Mr. Jackson looked up, took a deep breath. At this moment, the judge banged the gavel hard on the table. The trial began. The room fell silent. Everyone held their breath in anticipation. Thomas clenched his fists, his eyes shining with determination. This would be the moment when he had to do everything to prove his father's innocence. The gavel banged firmly on the table, pulling everyone into the tension of the trial. The room fell silent. Only the sound of the court clerk flipping papers could be heard. Mr. Jackson stood before the bar, his hands still cuffed, but his back was still straight, his eyes determined. Even though he was pushed into an unjust situation, he still did not allow himself to bow to fate. The judge spoke, his voice solemn. "Defendant Jackson, you are charged with robbery that afternoon. Do you have anything to say?" Mr. Jackson looked up, his voice slow but clear. "I didn't do it. I just helped the old lady who fell. But when I got there, the bag was gone. I'm not the thief." The plaintiff's lawyer chuckled softly, his tone cold. "Does the defendant have any witnesses to prove it? If not, empty words won't help you avoid the sentence." The whole audience began to whisper again. "No witnesses, then let's just give up. Poor but honest. How can that happen?" Thomas sat with his hands pressed tightly on his knees, his eyes red, but no tears fell. He knew the trial would be like this, but he still couldn't bear to see his father being oppressed. He suddenly stood up, his voice childish but resounding in the courtroom. "I'm a witness. I was there. I saw everything." Everyone turned around in surprise. Some people started to whisper, "It's the boy, the defendant's son." What can a child testify? The judge looked at Thomas, his eyes stern but softened a little at the boy's courage. "What is your name?" "I'm Thomas, your father's son." The boy took a breath, his voice trembling but determined. "I was there. I saw my father only helping the old lady and not taking anything." The plaintiff's lawyer sneered, looking at Thomas with disdain. "Kid, do you have any evidence? Anyone can say it just by talking." Thomas took a deep breath, his eyes meeting the lawyer standing in front of him. His voice rang out, not trembling at all. "Of course I have evidence. But before I do, I want to ask one thing. Are all poor people guilty and all rich people are innocent?" The whole courtroom fell silent for a few seconds. The plaintiff's lawyer frowned, crossed his arms over his chest, and sneered. "Kid, what are you talking about? This is a criminal trial, not a place for you to question the law." Thomas clenched his fists, his voice trembling, but his eyes still flashing. "I'm not questioning the law. I just want to know why people are so quick to convict my father just because he's poor. If my father had worn a fancy suit and driven a car that day, would anyone have suspected him? Or would they have thought he was just passing by?" The audience began to whisper. "The boy is right. If he was a rich man, he wouldn't have been caught on the spot." "Well, we've always thought that poor people are more likely to commit crimes, but who can say for sure that rich people don't do wrong things?" The judge looked at Thomas, his eyes darkened, his hand unconsciously tapping lightly on the wooden table. He didn't say anything, but secretly admired the boy's sharpness. The plaintiff's lawyer was a little stunned, perhaps not expecting a child to be able to put the court in a passive position. He raised his eyebrows, lowered his voice, and tried to regain the initiative. "You are beating your concept. This court is not based on rich or poor, but on evidence and witnesses. If you have evidence as you said, then present it." Thomas pursed his lips. He knew he could not drag it out any longer. He reached into his pocket, took out the old tape recorder, and held it up in front of everyone. "This is my evidence. I recorded what the old lady said right after my father was arrested." The whole courtroom burst into cheers. People were talking excitedly. "There was a recording? The boy is really smart. But what is the content?" The judge signaled to play the recording. The recording echoed in the quiet space. "I don't remember very well. I was just pushed down, and then when I looked up, I saw him standing there. I'm not sure. Maybe it wasn't him. The old lady herself said so." At this moment, the plaintiff's lawyer's face turned pale. The judge banged the gavel again, looking straight at the investigating police officer. "So, the only witness did not confirm that the defendant was the culprit. So why was Mr. Jackson arrested right at the scene?" The police officer was sweating, stammering. We only arrested people based on inference and initial statements." Below, the audience began to discuss. Some people felt regretful for hastily convicting Mr. Jackson. Thomas clenched his fists, looking towards his father. For the first time since the incident, he saw a glimmer of hope in his father's eyes. But the story was not over yet. The plaintiff's lawyer tried to refute. "But that still doesn't prove who the real thief is. If it wasn't the defendant, then who took the bag?" At that moment, another voice rang out from the courtroom door. "I know who the real thief is." The room turned around. A man walked in. He was holding a phone with a video clip in his hand. This person was the owner of the grocery store near the crime scene. Everyone held their breath. Where would this drama go? Thomas clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He could feel that the truth was about to be revealed. The middle-aged man walked to the middle of the courtroom. His face was filled with a mixture of worry and determination. He took a deep breath and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I am the owner of the grocery store near the crime scene. I have a security camera video recording the whole incident." The audience was in an uproar. "Security camera! So there is real evidence?" Thomas's eyes widened, his heart pounding in his chest. He held his breath, staring at the phone in the man's hand. The judge nodded, signaling the court clerk to receive and connect the video to the large screen in the courtroom. Everyone turned to look at it. The atmosphere was so tense that you could hear the sound of swallowing saliva. The screen flashed for a few seconds. Then the image appeared. In the video, the small street appeared clearly. An old lady was slowly walking across the street. Then suddenly a man in black ran past, snatching the old lady's bag. The snatch was so strong that the old lady lost her balance and fell to the sidewalk. Just a few seconds later, a man rushed over. It was Mr. Jackson. He hurriedly helped the old lady up, anxiously asking her questions. But at that moment, a passerby saw the scene and shouted loudly, "He snatched her bag!" A few more people ran over, saw the old lady fall and her bag gone, and immediately assumed that Mr. Jackson was the thief. Less than a minute later, the police siren sounded, and Mr. Jackson was arrested on the spot, despite his continued explanations. The video ended, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. After a while, whispers began to rise. "Oh my God, he's really innocent. We've wrongly blamed an honest man. So where's the real thief?" Thomas gripped the chair tightly, tears silently falling. He knew his father had done nothing wrong, but when he saw the evidence to prove it with his own eyes, he still couldn't hold back his emotions. In the dock, Mr. Jackson stood motionless. His eyes were red, his hands clenched, trying to suppress his emotions. For the past month, he had lived in injustice, in the contemptuous eyes of the world. And now, finally, the truth had come to light. The judge spoke loudly. "In the face of this clear evidence, the court declares the defendant Jackson innocent." The gavel banged down loudly. The room erupted in sighs of relief. Some people clapped softly. Some people who had previously spoken harshly about Mr. Jackson could only bow their heads in shame. Thomas jumped up and ran to his father. "Father, you've been vindicated." He rushed to hug Mr. Jackson tightly. Mr. Jackson was silent for a few seconds. Then he also hugged his son, his calloused hand trembling and gently brushing his son's hair. "Thank you, my son, Thomas." The father and son hugged each other tightly in the middle of the courtroom, where many eyes were still watching. But at this moment, they no longer cared about anyone, only the joy of reunion, the relief after so much suffering, and the father-son relationship that was stronger than ever. It was a moment that no one in the courtroom that day could forget. The day after the trial declared Mr. Jackson innocent. The judge ordered him to be released immediately in court. All charges against him were dismissed. Everyone in the room, including the lawyers, smiled with relief. But the surprise did not stop there. The police officer who had arrested Mr. Jackson before, the one who had hastily concluded that he was the culprit without a thorough investigation, was asked to write a self-criticism right in court. It was a severe punishment for a police officer for failing to fulfill his duty and causing a wrongful conviction. At this time, the police officer stood with his head bowed, his face red, not daring to look at anyone in the room. The judge ordered that this matter be handled seriously, and at the same time requested a review of the investigation procedures to ensure that no further injustice would occur. When Mr. Jackson and Thomas walked out of the courtroom, the atmosphere in the court was filled with joy. Looking at their free eyes, looking back at the dark days they had experienced, both father and son felt like they had just stepped out of a nightmare. But they knew that, after all, love had helped them overcome all challenges. Mr. Jackson returned to his daily life, walking in the heart of the small street with complete joy. After so many dark days now, he felt the light of freedom and justice. Walking steadily on the familiar road, he could feel the affectionate gazes from the people in the neighborhood, as if the whole community welcomed him back. Mrs. Lan, a longtime neighbor, was the first to run up when she saw him. She held his hand tightly, her eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Jackson, I'm so happy for you. Finally, everything is clear. I haven't slept well for so long because of you. The whole neighborhood believes in you. You're not guilty." Mr. Jackson couldn't hold back his tears, nodding his thanks to Mrs. Lan. Her words were like a warm breeze, blowing away all the dark days. He felt warmer than ever. Then other neighbors came closer one by one, sharing his joy. "We always believed you were a good person, Mr. Jackson. Justice has been served. Don't worry about anything. Everything will be fine now. Everyone in this neighborhood has been worried about you these past few months. We are so happy to see you back. Mr. Jackson could only nod, unable to speak. The congratulatory words from his neighbors made him feel that he was no longer alone. They were like friends, loved ones who were always by his side, ready to support him in the most difficult times. When Mr. Jackson arrived at the small factory where he worked, the atmosphere was completely different from before. The simple colleagues who had gone through the difficult days of life with him now looked at him with eyes full of sympathy and affection. Uncle Thon, the factory manager, was the first to approach him, patting him on the shoulder. "I'm so happy for you, Jackson. We all believe that you are innocent, and now justice has spoken. The whole factory is very happy to see you back." Ms. Mai, his longtime colleague, said softly, "Mr. Jackson, you have finally escaped injustice. Every time I saw you these past few months, my heart ached. Now that you're back, we all feel relieved." Mr. Jackson looked into the eyes of his close friends and felt the sincerity in each word. Surely, after all the hardships, this is the reward he deserves, not only freedom, but also the love and support from those who always believed in him. Thomas, his son, stood beside him with a happy smile on his lips. He no longer had worries, no longer felt afraid of the future. For Mr. Jackson, the joy did not only come from the trial, but from the solidarity and support from everyone around him. "Dad, I'm so happy. Everyone believes in you," Thomas said, his eyes brighter than ever. He was not only happy because his father was exonerated, but also because of the love and sincerity of his relatives and colleagues for his father. Mr. Jackson smiled, gently patting Thomas's head. "Thank you, son. I'm not alone. I have family, relatives, friends. They have overcome all difficulties with me, and now I can live peacefully, work hard, and not worry about anything anymore." Those words resonated deeply, so touching. And that was the strong belief, the light that helped Mr. Jackson continue to walk on the road ahead, full of hope and love. One afternoon, when the yellow sunlight gradually faded, Mr. Jackson and Thomas sat on the porch, enjoying the cool air of the peaceful afternoon. Mr. Jackson sipped his tea, his eyes looking far away out onto the small road where the wind blew through, carrying the scent of a new life. Thomas sat next to him, holding a book in his hand, but his eyes were always on his father, smiling happily. Suddenly, a middle-aged man walked to the front of the alley. He was wearing a white shirt, shiny leather shoes, and a steady gait. It was the judge who had handled Mr. Jackson's case before. Mr. Jackson looked at him in surprise, but the judge's eyes were not stiff, but sincere and touching. "Hello, Mr. Jackson," the judge said, his voice warm and somewhat shy. Mr. Jackson stood up, his eyes filled with surprise and confusion. Thomas also raised his head, curious about what was going on. "Hello, sir. What business do you have?" Mr. Jackson asked, his voice a little hesitant. The judge smiled, walked over, and sat down on the opposite chair. His eyes softened, as if he was looking for a gentle way to say what he thought. "I came here to apologize. Thank you for your perseverance, and especially thank you, young Thomas. There was a time when I didn't believe it, but now I understand that justice cannot be hidden." Mr. Jackson looked at the judge, his heart slightly moved. He never thought he would hear an apology from someone who had been a judge in his life. But at this moment, he only felt the warmth from those words. The judge looked at Thomas, his eyes shining, full of gratitude and admiration. "Young man, you are a very special person. Your perseverance and courage are admirable. I must admit that you have helped open up a path that I had not seen before." Thomas sat still, feeling a little embarrassed to receive praise from someone like the judge, but his heart was filled with pride. "Thank you," Thomas said softly, then looked down at the ground, not saying anything more. He knew that his father had gone through too much pain and sadness. He only wished that his family's life would be peaceful forever. The judge turned back to look at Mr. Jackson, his voice slow and deep. "I am sorry for letting such a thing happen. I understand that not only Mr. Jackson, but also your whole family has to endure this pain. But I believe that you will overcome it all." Mr. Jackson was silent, his eyes slightly opened when he heard those words. The miserable days seemed to never end. Now he realized that everything could change. He looked at the judge, then at Thomas, his eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you. Mr. Jackson, sometimes I wonder if everything will turn out well. But your words of encouragement and my son's love have kept me from giving up." The judge held Mr. Jackson's hand. His deep eyes seemed to convey a strong encouragement. "You are not only a great father, but also a strong man. Mr. Jackson, I believe that despite the great difficulties, you still have many good things ahead of you. Don't let the past hinder the future. Keep living, working, and teaching Thomas. Life always has a way of giving back what has been lost." Mr. Jackson felt choked up in his heart. That encouragement was like a blessing, like a breath of fresh air blowing through his soul, giving him the strength to continue on his new path. "Thank you. I will try," Mr. Jackson said, his voice choked up. Then he turned to Thomas, smiling warmly, as if to convey that no matter what, father and son would always be together. Thomas nodded, feeling the deep love from his father, from the judge, and from all those who had accompanied them. The hard times were now in the past, and the future, with all its hopes, would open up new, brighter opportunities. After a moment of silence and as the sun slowly set, Mr. Jackson felt a sense of peace he had never known. The pains of the past seemed to melt away, giving way to new hope, to love and recognition that he had not expected. He looked at Thomas with pride. The judge stood up and held out his hand. "I am glad it is over. I will continue my work, but I cannot forget your story, and Thomas. I wish you good health and do not let the past affect the future of the family." Mr. Jackson nodded, his eyes never leaving the judge. "Thank you. I will remember your words. As you said, we will not let the past hinder us. My family, especially Thomas, deserves a bright future." Thomas looked at the judge, his eyes still filled with respect and gratitude. "Thank you for understanding and helping my family. I will try to study hard and become a good person like my father." The judge smiled gently and nodded. "Little Thomas, you are a strong-willed and strong-hearted person. You will definitely do great things." After a while, the judge waved goodbye to Mr. Jackson and Thomas, then walked along the small path, leaving a warm and peaceful atmosphere in everyone's hearts. Mr. Jackson and Thomas sat for a while, both silent, but their hearts were filled with emotion. The difficult days had passed, and they knew that life was always full of challenges, but love would be the strength to help them overcome everything. Finally, Mr. Jackson looked at Thomas and said softly, "Thank you, Thomas. You helped me keep the faith. All the hardships will pass, but family love will always be like that."